Alright guys, it's finally here. Version 1.0 of ExpressLRS just got released, which means we're finally out of release candidates or nightly builds and onto an official 1.0 stable release version. And since this is technically the very first release, there's a ton of functionality that this one brings between this release and, well, when the project started back in 2019. So in tonight's episode, we'll take a look at some of the big ticket items that ExpressLRS contains in 1.0. We'll take a look at the supported hardware targets, and we'll also have a look at the type of performance that you can expect from the system. Now, before we jump into all the details in the release notes, let's take a quick look at the headlining features in ExpressLRS version 1.0. Super fast packet rates on 2.4 gig with 250 Hz as the default and 500 Hz for bleeding edge speed. Industry-leading low packet latency and consistent packet delivery to minimize jitter. Support for both 900 MHz and 2.4 gig options with reliable long-range link performance on both, even in noisy RF environments. Highly adjustable packet rates and antenna options so you can choose the best performance for your type of flying. Advanced telemetry for viewing and logging things like GPS in OpenTX. Wi-Fi updating, Betaflight and iNav pass-through updating, and OpenTX updating. And finally, support for a huge list of hardware targets, all the way from DIY options to budget-friendly options, all the way up to the not-so-budget-friendly options. Alright, that's the basics covered, so let's take a look at some of those features in a little bit more detail in the 1.0 release notes. So, ExpressLRS firsts, 200 Hz on 900 MHz. So ExpressLRS were the first ones to push the packet rate up to 200 Hz on a 900 MHz RC link, and it's actually still the only system to support a rate higher than 150 Hz, which is what Crossfire uses as its fastest rate. And you might be thinking to yourself, okay, well 200 Hz isn't that much faster than 150 Hz. What's the big deal? But the thing to keep in mind there is Crossfire switches to FSK modulation to do 150 Hz, which has significantly less range than LoRa, which is what they use for the 50 Hz mode, whereas ExpressLRS can maintain LoRa modulation all the way up to the 200 Hz packet rate. So essentially faster packet rates as well as better range, which means if you happen to crash out 100 meters away from yourself upside down, you can actually still turtle without dropping the link and fly back to yourself. All right, on to the next one. 250 and 500 Hz on 2.4. So these are the two fastest packet rates offered on the 2.4 gig variant. And again, ExpressLRS was the first system to support rates this high, which has really kind of helped to push the industry forward in what's considered as an acceptable packet rate for racing. So once again, both these packet rates are using LoRa modulation, so you don't need to worry as much about the level of RF noise in your local environment like you do with some of the other systems that are using FLRC or not LoRa. SMD antenna. This one's huge, or actually it's tiny. This is these tiny little surface mounted onboard antennas that are available on the Happy model receivers, as well as now the Namimno hardware as well, which are absolutely perfect for racing or any kind of other short range flying, because it means you no longer have to worry about mounting an antenna only to have it get chopped off on the first gate hit. They're also perfect for toothpicks or whoops or any other kind of lightweight build where every gram counts. Now speaking of whoops, another exciting feature is this, the SPI ExpressLRS integration in Betaflight, which means the SX1280 RF chip can now be directly connected to the F4 flight controller processor instead of having an additional processor to run the ExpressLRS code. This makes it possible for companies like Happy Model as well as Beta FPV to release all-in-ones with ExpressLRS 2.4 gig built in, and they can even use the SMD antenna, which the Happy Model one does, for a super simple lightweight whoop build. The other thing that the SPI integration brings to the table is another reduction in end-to-end latency, since we no longer have to talk via a serial UART between the RX and the Betaflight flight controller chip. Instead, they're connected via SPI, which is a much faster communication bus, and it means we can shave off a few more microseconds off the latency. Now, while we're on the topic of latency, let's take a quick look at the independent test results that Mark Spatz, aka UAV Tech, was getting when he tested the ExpressLRS 2.4 gig system recently. Now, this was some really thorough latency and jitter testing that Mark did using a tool that basically injects a signal into the gimbal of a handset, which gets sent over the air via whatever link he was testing at the time, gets received by the receiver and spat out the other end back into the latency test device. And what this means is Mark could measure the end-to-end latency from when you'd actually move the stick to when that would theoretically be received by the flight controller. And you can see here this green line is ExpressLRS sitting with the lowest latency of pretty much 2 milliseconds here. And possibly the more important thing to notice is that this line has nearly no spikes in it whatsoever, which tells us it also has the least amount of jitter in the packet delivery. All right, last on the list of firsts, bind phrases. So with ExpressLRS, there's no need to ever press a bind button on the RX to bind the TX and RX together. Instead, you just enter a custom binding phrase into the configurator when you flash your hardware, and then when you power them up, they're just automatically always connected. And this works for any number of TXs and RXs, so multi-bind is also supported out of the box. There are more traditional binding methods available if you do need them, but seriously, binding phrases just make it so simple and easy, and I friggin' hate it when I have to pull a Crossfire or a Ghost receiver out of the foam or out of a quad just to press the bind button on it because I've done a firmware update or something like that. So binding phrases is just so good and simple. All right, on to the feature list, and I think we've covered most of the things in this list here already, but there is one super big item here that was a relatively new addition to ExpressLRS, and that's this one, the configurator. So not too long ago we didn't have a configurator, and the way you had to flash the firmware was basically download the code, edit your user preferences in a settings file, compile the code, and then flash it using VS Code, which is basically a development tool. So this was a little bit daunting for people who basically aren't devs. So it was a huge leap forward when Jerg on Discord wrote the configurator, which basically gave everyone a much more user-friendly way to build and flash the firmware onto the hardware. It seriously made it so much more accessible for people, and it's one of the main reasons that we're actually able to cut the version 1.0 release. All right, moving on to telemetry support. And hopefully this will make a lot of people happy, because back when we didn't have telemetry support, man, was it the end of the world for some people. So much bitching and whinging about,
oh, but it doesn't have telemetry.
Anyway, we've got a whole bunch of rich telemetry data for you to all pollute the noise floor with now, including GPS telemetry, which I hear is hard to get on some of the other 2.4 gig systems. MSP pass-through, which means all the built-in Betaflight Lua scripts work in OpenTX, and selectable telemetry rates, so you can choose how fast you pollute the noise floor with all those telemetry packets. Quality of life stuff, we've covered everything in there except Wi-Fi updating, which is basically a super convenient method for updating the firmware on your RX wirelessly. You basically just power it on, wait for it to enter Wi-Fi, connect to the hotspot, and upload the firmware binary. And if you're super cool like JB, you can even do this from your phone if you've copied the binaries there in advance. Okay, moving on to the supported hardware. For Team 2.4, we've got the Happy Model ES24TX, which is the full-size JR module, as well as the light module for the T-Lite, and both of these will do a max of 250 milliwatts output power. On the RX side, we've got the Happy Model PP and EP receivers, which are the super small lightweight receivers that come with either the SMD antenna or the normal antennas. We've also got a new target for the upcoming Beta FPV TX, which is a light module to suit things like the Tango 2 and the X-Lite radios, and this one has a max power output of 500 milliwatts. Beta FPV also have a 2.4 gig receiver, and this one stands out from the rest a little bit because it has a power amp on board, so it can send telemetry back at 100 milliwatts output power. So this could be useful for anybody looking to do some long range on the 2.4 gig receivers. Next up is the Namimno Flash JR module, which uses a 1 watt power amp and comes with a heatsink and a fan pre-installed. So this should be capable of some pretty serious range on 2.4, even using the SMD antennas on the RX. And once again, Namimno also have their own RX offering, and these ones are a little bit bigger than the Happy Model ones, but they do have versions with the SMD antennas as well, which is pretty cool. The CE FM30TX module can be flashed to ExpressLRS, which has a max power output of 150 milliwatts, and the CE RXs can also be flashed, and these ones also have an RF on board for telemetry as well. And finally, we've got the Immersion RC Ghost targets for the full-size JR module, as well as the light module for things like the Tango 2 and the X-Lite handsets. And both of these will do a max of 250 milliwatts. On the RX side for Ghost, we've got the Atto, and I think the Zepto might also work under the Atto target. I'm not 100% sure on that. And finally, we've got a huge list of DIY designs that you can build up on the repo, but I won't go into that list here, so go check out the repo if you're interested. Alright, and for Team 900, again we've got a happy model offering for 900 MHz with the ES900TX, which is their newer module, as well as the ES915TX, which is the older STM based one. And both of these will do 1 watt power output. On the RX side, Happy Model have the ES900RX, which is the 900 MHz version of their 10x10mm receiver. Vita FPV also have a 900 MHz target in another light module format, which will do a max of 500 milliwatts, as well as an amplified RX that'll again do 100 milliwatts of telemetry power output. There's the Namimno Voyager module, which is another solid looking 1 watt capable TX and RX. Neutron RC have a 900 MHz target, but they mainly seem to sell into China only at the moment. And finally, there's the FrSky R9 TXs and RXs, and there's a whole big list of these that are compatible, which I won't go into here. And all of those targets are up on the README on the repo, so I'd advise you go and have a look there if you want to have a look at which ones are supported. And the last thing on the topic of targets, if you're a manufacturer that's looking to support ExpressLRS with hardware, please do contact us on Discord, get in touch with the devs, and they'd be happy to help add new targets. Alright guys, that's going to wrap this one up for the first ever ExpressLRS release video. If you do have any questions about the release or about ExpressLRS in general, make sure you do jump on Discord. There's a huge community of people and the server's always got somebody online, so jump in and start chatting and get involved. Alright, thanks for watching guys, see ya!